A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Siddiq, a student from the Faculty of Law. Welcome to You Alive, organized by NUS Alumni Relations. You Alive, Lifting Thought Leadership is a quarterly speaker series that features global thought leaders and captains of industries who will share their personal journeys and engage in an open dialogue. Each speaker will have 30 minutes to share about a topic close to their hearts, followed by a 20-minute interview with our moderator, Mr. Vishwa Sadasivan, and end with a 40-minute Q&A session. In our Q&A session, you may make your way to the microphones placed along the aisles, introduce yourself, and speak directly into them. This is essential so that the online community is able to hear your question. We will also be using Pigeonhole Live. If you have a smartphone, tablet, or laptop computer with you, just launch your internet browser and go to pigeonhole.at. Key in the event passcode, which is UALIVE. I repeat, UALIVE. Click Go, and you're free to fire away all your burning questions or vote for any question that interests you. Popular questions with more votes will stand a higher chance of being answered. Mr. Dan Shefet is the president and founder of the Association for Accountability and Internet Democracy. A trained lawyer, Mr. Shefet believes in the democracy and power of the internet and hopes to introduce a general principle of accountability to secure the protection of human integrity online. Tonight, we are very honored to have Mr. Shefet here to share his journey towards responsible usage of the internet. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome on stage Mr. Dan Shefet.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Does it work? Can you hear me? Yes. I did switch it on, but I don't know whether there's double mute on it, but I understand from the way that you react that you can hear me. That's lovely. It's lovely also to see so many of you arrive in spite of the weather. I must see, that's quite impressive, quite impressive. The subject that I'll be speaking about tonight is accountability. And when I shall speak about accountability, I shall speak about accountability in the legal sense of the word. Not the ethical, not the moral sense of the word. I shall speak about accountability being rules, being laws that are applied by the judiciary, by the courts, by judges, that have sanctions, civil sanctions and or penal sanctions. So when I speak about accountability, please note that it's legal accountability. Now, having said that, we have to be very careful, because if we want to apply accountability to a certain sector, we have to be extremely cautious, both to be clear as to what the rules are, because violation of those rules includes sanctions, and we have to be very, very, very clear understanding what are the values that we wish to protect through these laws and regulations, and what are the conflicts that these values may have with other values. So that's what I am talking about when I talk about accountability. Why am I talking about accountability? Why is accountability important? Well, it's a secret to no one that the internet has become so much part of our daily lives, a part of our civilization, part of our democracy, that we really can't live without it. And it's clear that there is a correlation between online content, what we read and what we see on the internet, and the way we behave. Online content creates offline behavior. There's been a lot of science on this. Psychologists and sociologists have spent quite a lot of effort on trying to somehow quantify this correlation, putting it in different categories. The categories that I choose to put it in as the president of the association is 3 different categories of correlation. And to each of those 3 categories corresponds a specific set of accountability rules. The first one is the effect that content on the internet has on the individual, on everybody in this room. The effect that it has on your integrity, on your dignity, on your chances of integrating society and living a normal life. That's really what this is all about. So this deals with defamation. It deals to a certain extent with discrimination. It deals also to a certain extent with hate speech directed against you as an individual. This is one category where we need to define a set of accountability rules so that you as individuals are protected against what I just described. The second category is what I call societal values. That's democracy. That's fake news. Very, very, very in vogue these days to talk about fake news. Actually, it is probably the greatest threat to democracy that we have today. Now, whether or not the election of Trump was actually a consequence of fake news generated from Russia or from Macedonia, who cares? One thing is absolutely clear, that is that it had an impact. Whether that impact was decisive or not doesn't make any difference to me. It had an impact. And next time, it may have a decisive impact. So we need to see what we can do about fake news. Now, fake news is not just a problem to democracy, it's also a problem to business. Fake news in the business environment has a wonderful name. That name is astroturfing. Have you heard about that before? Okay, some of you have. Astroturfing is, of course, an oxymoron. It's something that doesn't exist. The stars and the turf don't exist. So it is fake reviews on sites like that, hotels, restaurants, and so on. That's a classic. But it's also fake reviews on products. A competitor starts disseminating fake information, false information about his competitor's products. And you as consumers, you are misled by that, to the detriment of maybe the better product, but your competitor pays more in slurring, because that's actually what happens, the less good product, but you think that it's a better product. That is very, very, very dangerous. We also have fake news in the business environment dealing with what I call outsider trading. It is the opposite of insider trading. There are cases where information on the internet has led companies to lose 17% overnight of their market share. Can you imagine? Listed companies. Because somebody has started some rumor, completely unfounded, and everybody believes it's true. That's what I call outsider information. It's even more dangerous than insider information today. So that's another kind of fake news. And of course, the last of the three categories is the category which is toxic content or internet content, which leads to destabilization of world peace, which leads to incitement. We see that in different countries already, where the internet can actually fuel, aggravate, and even create incitement, and who knows what that's going to do to regional stability and global stability. So these are the three categories of content on the internet which can lead to dramatic consequences. How do we make someone, and I'll get back to who that someone is, accountable in the legal sense of the word for disseminating content that has consequences as one, two, or three of these categories? Well, who do we make accountable? Well, we could make the authors accountable. Two problems with making the authors, the people that put this information on the internet. Two problems. The first is we won't find them. They're anonymous. And even if we do find them, they're in a country that will not allow us to enforce our laws against them, that will not cooperate on providing e-evidence, and that will not extradite them because it's not a criminal offense in their country. And as you probably all know, extradition treaties only apply if the crime in question is also a crime in the host country. So it's a lot of efforts which serve no purpose whatsoever, apart from the fact that it's technologically almost impossible. So forget about holding the authors accountable, apart from maybe 1%, and even that's too much. The trend has been, over the past 3 years, to hold the infrastructure providers accountable. That is, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, and so on and so forth. And why do we do that? We do that, again, because we can't find the authors, and we also do it because we think that they can do something about it. They can do something about it that we in this room cannot, and that our government cannot, and our judges and our police force cannot, but they can. So why do we believe that, for instance, Facebook and the Googles and the rest of them can do something about this? Well, we believe so because sometimes they actually do, and sometimes they're actually successful in taking down hurtful content. And we believe that they have the technology, the algorithms that can actually identify hurtful content. But you know what? We're wrong. They don't have that technology. Sometimes they have, but very often they don't. All they can do in general is act upon notices that come from you in this room. You have to cooperate in signaling to them what you identify on the net as being hurtful. So let's say that you do that. What are their obligations then when they receive such a signal from you? Now comes the hard part, because remember I talked about accountability in the legal sense of the word. Let me take a practical example here. This was on the 11th of November, very recent. There was a photojournalistic report on Facebook about events that took place in Warsaw, Poland on the 11th of November. Terrible events, 60,000 people demonstrated for hate speech, get the foreigners out of Poland, and so on and so forth. Highly discriminatory, even with some Nazi connotations. 60,000 people. So on Facebook, there were photos of this event. Facebook took it down. Now, the guy who put it on there was a journalist. He took the photos. So you have to ask yourselves, do we have a right to see those photos, even though some of the banners say what I just described, hate speech, genocide, throw out the foreigners, and so on? Well, in my opinion, of course we have that right. It is part of information. We have that right to that information. Facebook took it down. Facebook took it down because they are very concerned now with what is happening all over the world, especially after the hearings 2 weeks ago at the US Senate, as a consequence of the Russian probe now into the elections as to whether Facebook, Google, and Twitter could have done something about it. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend that you watch the podcast. It's about 3 hours. It's very, very interesting. The 3 general counsels of these 3 companies defended themselves very well. But they see that things are coming. Things that I personally like to see coming, but we shouldn't exaggerate. Very, very dangerous. So getting back to my example, should Facebook have taken down photos of these demonstrations in Warsaw? Of course not. We all have a right to see that. Now, if the journalist would have added to those photos his personal observations, saying that I think they're right, and I think that all these foreigners should be killed or gassed or whatever he would feel like saying, then of course Facebook should have taken it down. So these are extremely complicated judgment calls, and remember, if they're accountable, as I said in the beginning, they may be penalized for it. It's a criminal offense, so be very, very careful with what we do. Still, we want to hold them accountable because we have no choice. Because if we don't, as I just said in the beginning, we have toxic content that will affect our lives, our democracies, and even stability all over the world. And we as government, we cannot stop it. So we have to hold them accountable, in spite of the problems I just mentioned. So let me just try to describe some of the legal and philosophical problems in holding them accountable as a point of departure. On what legal basis do we want to hold these companies accountable? Well, the first theory is that they are the gateways, that they deliver the infrastructure and the gateways, and therefore they are accountable for whatever travels on their system. I'm sorry, that doesn't work as a legal theory. Absolutely groundless in law to say that just because you deliver, again, the classic examples is, of course, weapons and even auto routes and so on. If accidents happen, you are not accountable. So on what legal basis do we hold them accountable if it's not because they provide infrastructure? Well, there's another theory saying that it's the least cost avoider, meaning that if from a societal point of view, holding them accountable is a better deal for society in general than doing it yourself, then they are from a legal point of view accountable. That doesn't make sense either. We cannot have a legal theory saying that just because it is cheaper to hold you accountable for something that the government should deal with, then you have a legally enforceable criminal obligation to do so. Doesn't stick, doesn't hold. Sorry, doesn't work. What else can we invent? What else can we come up with as a legal theory holding them accountable? Well, maybe it is because they are common carriers. You may not know what common carriers really means in terms of law. It's a common law concept saying that at a certain point in time, you become almost like a public utility, like electricity and water and so on, and therefore you have certain obligations. Now we're getting very close to a legal theory that could actually stand up in court, that could actually be developed as a comprehensive legal theory that could apply worldwide based on the notion of common carrier, saying more or less that these companies have become public utilities. Now, if they are public utilities, that means that they're licensed. A public utility is licensed, and therefore there's a contract, and therefore there's oversight, like in the communications sector, FCC in the US, and you have similar oversight agencies in this country for the broadcasting industry, the press and the media, and so on. Can we have common carrier obligations and public utility obligations without government agency oversight? Well, from a pure legal point of view, the answer is yes. But will it work in practice? I'm afraid it won't. Which brings me to say that we need a government agency if our theory is to hold them accountable on the basis of common carrier. And that brings me to, I think I have maybe 5 or 10 minutes left. I promised to do this in about half an hour. That brings me to the last section of this introductory speech, which is what is the government agency that we need to put in place in order to allow us as government, as society, to hold these infrastructure providers accountable? Well, I'd like to ask you a question here. Where do we see already now that public obligations of law enforcement and protecting the citizen are delegated to the private sector? Because that is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the public sector has even a monopoly on law enforcement. It is illegal for anybody in this room to enforce the law yourself. If you have a problem with the law, you go to the police. That's the basic system of democracy and of state. So if we as government delegate that to the private sector, we are delegating our obligations to protect you as citizens to a private party. Where do we see that in society today? Well, let me help you here. Money laundering. The financial sector, and this is over 20 years, has accepted stronger and stronger restrictions and obligations on due diligence, origins of funds, know your customer. There are a number of directives that come out from the United Nations, they come from the European Commission, and OECD and the Basel directives. We have Bruno Lanvin here with us, who knows a lot about these rules. Today, everybody takes it for granted, especially the financial sector, that they have these obligations. And you know what? In the latest UN rules that came out, resolution from, well, about a year ago now, they included real estate agents, lawyers, notaries, accountants. But just think about real estate agents. Real estate agents are now financial institutions and have a reporting obligation when they see suspicious movements. They have due diligence obligation. They have an obligation to know the origin of funds. Now that is delegating law enforcement to the private sector. We take that for granted. How come the financial sector has accepted this? And how come we all take that for granted? Well, I think the answer is that all we're actually telling them is that they have a reporting obligation. If a bank identifies suspicious movements, all they're supposed to do is report that to the local whatever agency it is. And then they have no further obligations than do what they are directed to do by that agency. So a bank, the compliance officer will identify something, they'll go through some legal prima facie review, they'll report it to the financial agency in question, and they'll wait. Either the instruction will be, don't do anything, we want to follow the flow of funds, we want to see where it comes from, where it's going, this could be interesting. Or it'll be, freeze those funds immediately. Or it'll be, don't do anything at all, we don't care. And the financial institution has only one obligation, which is to do what it is instructed to do by the government agency in question. So let's see how that relates to accountability on the internet. What we need is a government agency on the internet which allows us to delegate, just like to the financial sector, those obligations that we as government have, which means that all we can oppose, the only obligation that we can impose on social media and on search engines and so on and so forth is to report. Now, who should they report to? And this is where the Internet Ombudsman comes in, which is an idea that we're working very strongly to promote with the Association for Accountability and Democracy. It's an idea that we first saw in a draft before the Senate in Paris, and which has now been adopted as a motion for recommendation for the Council of Europe, covering 47 countries. It's not the European Union, it's the Council of Europe, which will probably lead to a treaty resolution in May of next year. The so-called rapporteur has been designated, and I met with him 2 weeks ago, and I think we're on the right track here. The Internet Ombudsman would be appointed in each and every country and be at the service of the infrastructure providers, the Googles and the rest of them, when either they identify something themselves or they're put on notice by someone in this room that there is this terrible photo of people demonstrating in Warsaw, and they're carrying these banners of a highly discriminatory and hate speech related nature. And Facebook and the others, instead of reacting the way they do now, which is overreacting and which poses a severe problem to the right for information, they will have access to this Internet Ombudsman who will give them a recommendation. Now, I'm using the word recommendation deliberately. I'm not talking about a judgment or a decision. It will only be a recommendation carrying the moral weight of the Internet Ombudsman and his service in question. Now, we live in a reputation economy and a reputation society, for better or for worse. So moral weight is very, very, very important. And if the Internet Ombudsman in a country says, I think you should take it down, and the Facebooks and the others do not do so, of course, that will be transparent, that will be public knowledge, and especially the advertisers will know about this. And guess what will happen when the advertisers will stop advertising, right? The problem will solve itself because the business model will solve it for us. So the recommendations that will come out from the Internet Ombudsman will not be decisions, as I just said, because if they were legally binding, we would have a problem with the rule of law. Because the rule of law would say that they would have a right to defense. That is, the author of the information that we want to take down would have the right to defense, the right to representation, the right of appeal, and it would take us 5 years. So we would have completely defeated the purpose of holding these players accountable. Therefore, it can only be a recommendation, otherwise it would violate the principle of the rule of law. We're moving towards this solution, and if we arrive at having an Internet Ombudsman in each country, we're left with one problem, and this will be my last couple of minutes, and that is, what do we do when different countries have different recommendations on the same content? And believe me, that is going to happen. That's going to happen more often than not, right? So many cultures, so many values. We probably can agree on some basics, all of us, but a lot of it is going to be dictated by cultural differences. So what do we do given the nature of the internet being a universal medium, where it serves absolutely no purpose to take something down on .sg if you can access it on .com? Are we building something that has no value, no real significance at all? Well, I hope not. And the solution to that problem is the International Internet Ombudsman. We at AAID are also working on that. We're very fortunate that on the 31st of May of next year at The Hague in the Netherlands, at the Peace Palace, which is the seat of the International Court of Justice, as you know, which is a very, very symbolic venue for international justice, probably the most symbolic in the world, we'll be hosting a conference organized by AAID together with the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the City of The Hague on the subject of the Internet values and the subject of the creation of an Internet Ombudsman, who will most probably be located, be seated, so to speak, within the Peace Palace at The Hague. The International Internet Ombudsman, and this is going to be extremely difficult in the beginning, but I see no other way of solving the problem. Let me tell you that in private practice, I've seen too often that you obtain a judgment in one country, and it has no effect in another, and it therefore serves no purpose. There are two leading cases right now that will help the Internet Ombudsman guide him. One case came down in June from the Supreme Court, Ottawa, Canada, the so-called Equistic case, which gave the Canadian courts the right to impose upon Google to take down certain content on .com, that is in the US. In the European Union, we are waiting for the judgment from the European Court of Justice, pursuant to a request from the Council, from the Conseil d'État in France, from the 27th of February, on the same question. We will probably get the same answer, in other words, that it is possible for an international organization to instruct the Google and the rest of them to take down content worldwide. Of course, we will see a major value clash, or maybe even civilizational clash, between the US and the rest of the world. Because in the US, freedom of speech is deemed to be a value that has a higher ranking than other values. I totally disagree. I think there's no hit parade of human rights. They all have the same value, and therefore what we need to do is work with our American friends to make them understand that their First Amendment position, which says that no law shall restrict freedom of speech, needs to be adapted to the fact that the companies in question are based in the US. One closing remark. Companies, this would ultimately lead to a treaty. And that treaty would be based more or less on the philosophy that we saw in 2008, which was fighting tax evasion. You all remember what happened there. Everybody said that the banking secrecy in Switzerland is there forever. It was like a God-given, almost a God-given thing. But it changed. It changed very, very, very quickly. And a blacklist and a gray list was established of countries that were deemed to be cooperative and not cooperative. You probably know that, all of you. And you don't want to be, as a country, on the non-cooperative, on the blacklist, because then your financial institutions disappear, and you're no longer part of the international community, and certainly not part of OECD or the World Trade Organization. Our suggestion would be to say, ultimately, that countries that in spite of this effort to arrive at international consensus and cooperation, decide for whatever reason to remain outside of this system, would somehow also be on this gray or on this blacklist. Countries against which you will have sanctions applied because they don't follow the rules of the game that the international community agrees on. I'm afraid that my time is up, and I hope we'll have lots of questions and time to discuss all of this. Why don't you join me, Viswa? Thank you.
Well, my friend.
Thank you. I'm glad they're not filming this.
Are you not? I hope so.
Okay.
Please, have a seat. First of all, I have to declare that I'm a member of the board of AAID, and Bruno Lawan, you want to take a bow? He is also a member of the board. So you must wonder what makes this man take on such a Herculean, seemingly impossible task. An important task, but a seemingly impossible task. Actually, there's a reason. In 2015, he took on Google. And that case is very well known. It's often labeled as the right to be forgotten. So I shall leave it to Dan to tell us that story that started this entire movement.
Well, yes, thank you, yes. Well, life is full of coincidences. This is not 100% coincidence, because I've always been interested in human rights and in technology. So it's not 100% coincidence. But what happened was that as a lawyer, I did my job in society, which was to represent my client. And we won the case. The problem was that the opponent was a poor loser. He fled the country, took up domicile in another country, which protected him, simply failing to have extradition treaties, which is why I'm interested in extradition treaties, and started a campaign on the internet against the client and against everyone who had anything to do with that client. There were about 20 of us in that group, and I was a proud member of that group. Being the lawyer who won the case, he certainly did not approve of me as a person. And, but I was not the only one. The 20 of us were slurred and defamed. It was absolutely awful. I was charged with being a member of the Serbian mafia. And again, proof that that is not true is that the guy is still alive. Right? I mean, this so this was the level. In the beginning, what happens is when you see stuff like that about you, you laugh at it. But then when you start getting questions from colleagues around the world saying, what is this? And you feel that you have to defend yourself. You have to defend yourself against stuff like that. And then you ask yourself, what about the people that never ask you, what is this, but simply never contact you? Mm-hmm. Because they, better not touch, we don't know what we know, better stay away. Because that is the way many of us react. We live in a society today where you need to cover yourself for whatever decision you make, especially board members and others. So if there's any doubt as to whether you should work with a person or not, well, better not do it. I won't get a promotion if I work with the wrong guy. Right? This is what we are all living with. And this is what you face when you apply for a job and the rest of your life, that the persons who will actually work with you, they risk their own credibility and sometimes their own career.
In fact, I'm told that in hiring decisions, increasingly multinational corporations check your Facebook account.
Yeah.
Right. So that's already happening.
Absolutely. So I took Google to court on the basis of a decision from the European Court of Justice and on the basis of the then applicable European directive, which had developed the theory of the right to be forgotten. Now, you probably all heard about the right to be forgotten, and you probably didn't hear from a legal point of view what it really is, because there's a lot of mythology about what it is and what it isn't. But basically what it says is that you have a right if the information on the internet has the potential of destroying your life, basically, to get that information out. Now, you have to know one thing is that it may be factually correct. But if it happened like 10 years ago or something like that, you served your sentence. It's a very humane approach to what we find in criminal law already all over the world, that there is a statute of limitation. Either you cannot be persecuted for something because you're only charged after the statute of limitation, or you go to prison and you're out and you start a new life. On the internet, it's the same sort of idea, even if you committed something that should actually have certain effects, sanctions, you're given a new lease of life. So we obtained that, and we obtained it worldwide. Unfortunately, Google is fighting that decision in other jurisdictions in terms of what we call global reach. So yes, indeed,
so
that made me understand how important it is.
So it's applied in Europe, but not the rest of the world? Google.
Google takes the position that the right to be forgotten only applies within the European Union. You're perfectly right. However, that question is extremely complicated under public international law. Question, again, to simplify, but it's pending now before the International Court of Justice as a separate question, but to simplify that extremely complicated question, you may say that there's one school of thought, which is Google's, which says, how can you in Europe decide what we in the US can read on the internet? That's one school of thought. There's a lot to be said about that. Another school of thought is the European one, which says we have our laws and in our country, and if you want to do business within our jurisdiction, you have to conform to our laws. If you don't like it, you're welcome to stay away. But if you are here, this is the deal. This is the deal. And part of that deal, and you're not obliged to do business here, is that if you have something on the internet that hurts a citizen in Europe, then due to the very nature of the internet, that has to be taken down worldwide. And if you don't like it, go away. That's the other school of thought.
But what's interesting is, I'm told that Google has since received more than 1 million requests for links to be removed.
Yeah.
Man?
Yep.
More than 1 million requests. In other words, there's a lot of bombardment as a result of this particular case. The question I'd like to ask you, based on your speech just now, it's actually not fair on Google altogether, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a private company. Is it really fair on a private company to expect it to know what to remove and when?
And that is why we need the Internet Ombudsman. Absolutely,
Right.
You're perfectly right. The right to be forgotten is probably the most difficult judgment call of all. What Google did was, much to their credit, they put together what they called an advisory board, which came out with a report on the 6th of February 2016, trying to give some guidance to Google and to the rest of the industry on how to deal with this right. And again, it was guidance that tried to categorize the different individuals concerned, saying, for instance, that if it was information about a public figure, that could be a politician, but it could be other public figures, then the right to be forgotten probably does not apply. Because again, talking about the deal, you accepted once you became a public figure that you would be slurred and defamed. If it is information about liberal profession, including myself as lawyers, we are in the middle category, and if there are like 5 or 6 categories, just to give you an idea of how this worked. Now, I have a problem with that categorization, because in my opinion, public figures, they don't deserve less protection, but more protection than anybody else. We have seen the problem with fake news, and we have seen how Angela Merkel risked losing the election because of a defamation campaign against her as a public figure, being credited wrongly with allowing 800,000 terrorists to immigrate to the country, while, of course, she only allowed 800,000 refugees. That could have swayed the vote, and maybe there will be new elections in Germany because of that bit of fake news. That shows to me that a public figure should be more protected and not less protected.
But there's always a risk.
Of course.
And talking about Singapore's experience, there's always the possibility of your idea or AID's idea that could be misabused by various jurisdictions that may have the intention of restricting freedom of expression in their own jurisdictions. Is that possible?
Absolutely.
So how would your organization, how would AID tackle that?
The way the right to be forgotten has been translated into national law in the 28 member states of the European Union is that there is a qualification which says that the content in question has to be manifestly illicit. It actually came out from a French case where the original French law that implemented the right to be forgotten did not have the word manifestly in it, and that was censored by the Constitutional Court in Paris, saying you cannot hold accountable Google and the rest of them for something that is not manifestly, clearly illicit. So the first thing is that in terms of abuse, we are only left with situations where it's not clear. And dealing with those situations where it's not clear is where the Internet Ombudsman comes in.
Yeah.
Now today, the situation is that in that category which is not clear, you have, as an individual, to avail yourself of the normal judiciary. You have to sue Google and say, I believe that even though it's not manifestly illicit, it is illicit, it should be taken down. And Google just sit and wait for the judge to judge. It'll take you 2 or 3 or 5 years, whichever jurisdiction you're in. Again, that defeats the purpose. So this is also where the Internet Ombudsman comes in for situations related to the right to be forgotten, which are not manifestly clear.
Yeah. So let's now move to the position of the Internet Ombudsman. Right. First of all, is it an individual, or is it going to be an office comprising a group of individuals? What's the plan?
So the original idea for the Internet Ombudsman actually came from a report that I wrote for UNESCO a couple of years ago on online radicalization. It was for a conference that took place in Quebec last year. And it was in the course of interviewing law enforcement, ministers of justice, Interpol, and so on in different countries that I realized how difficult it is to identify sites which are deemed to be radicalizing. Let me just give you an example so we all understand, and I'll get to answer your question. I won't recommend that you do this, but if you were to do it, the sites of Daesh, the sites are called Dabiq. There are 14 releases of videos, and the videos are all like 30 minutes. Steven Spielberg quality, absolutely fantastic.
These are ISIS sites.
These
right?
are ISIS sites. It's called Dabiq, they're a news agency. And from a professional point of view, it's really top Hollywood quality. And they're all in 3 different sections. The first section, which is 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, is horrible scenes of people being beheaded and slaughtered in the most terrible ways. Another 10 minutes is children playing in kindergarten, life in the caliphate. And the third section of 10 minutes is an old bearded man reciting from the Quran. So you ask yourself, what is illegal? What is illegal? Actually, you're asking maybe the wrong question. Maybe you should be asking, what is the most dangerous part of these 3 sections? Now, what do you think here? What is the most dangerous part of those 3?
The
what
middle.
Do you think? Which one? The third one? The guy who recites the Quran? What do you think? Well, no, it's actually the second.
I think the middle.
Yeah, the second.
The children.
The children
Yeah.
playing in the playground, that is the seductive one.
Yeah.
The other one is more cerebral, it's more rational, it's reciting the Quran, and the first one is a complete put-off. That does not make you go to another country and fight. It's the seduction that is.
And it's the
But-
juxtaposition.
Absolutely. But is that illegal? Of course it's not illegal. So the contextual analysis and the authorship makes it by association illegal. Now, I'm giving this example to get back to an answer to your question, which is, what is the Internet Ombudsman? Is it a person or not?
Yeah.
I realized this when working for a couple of days together with a French judge who was at the Supreme Court, the Cour de Cassation in Paris, and who, under the former emergency decrees in France, which has now been replaced by a law, was appointed to exercise judicial oversight of the Ministry of Interior's decision to take down websites. All right, the Ministry of Interior had, until the 1st of November this year, it's now been replaced by law, the right to take down a website because they believed that it was incitement, radicalization, and so on. And I reviewed together with this judge how he would decide afterwards which of the 3 sections was illegal and so on and so forth. And it was clear to me that this is the kind of individual that we need. Now, is it a judge from a Supreme Court, or is it somebody who has the normal moral recognition in the country, a professor of philosophy, ethics, law, I don't know what. But we need a person, this judge in question has a lot of moral clout. We need a person like that. But of course, he has an office at his disposal. The term ombudsman is a Scandinavian word, which has now been adopted by countries all over the world for whatever they want to make out of it. It could be an agency to which consumers can complain. It can be an agency that you can complain to if you have a problem with your government and so on. That's an ombudsman. And these existing ombudsmen in their different domains are typically individuals which have this high prestige, and then they have an office of 300 people working for them.
Right. So the question, my concern is this, right? As we have acknowledged, it's a very ambiguous kind of a situation. And it's going to get more and more ambiguous. It's going to be about values. There's going to be an element of subjectivity. How is one individual, even with his supreme or her supreme wisdom, going to continually be able to make the right judgment call? In fact, there is already an inherent risk in doing that. So I would suggest, number one, that you probably need a group of people who, through their own discussions, will be able to arrive at what might be a wise decision. Secondly, it becomes even more complex when you're talking about the international Internet Ombudsman. Already within one particular jurisdiction, it'll be very difficult for you because there are people of different races, different religions, and different persuasions who have different ways, different optics, right? Now, if you talk about at a global level, if you were to create this particular office at The Hague, and the individual is European, first of all, not all European countries may agree with this decision. I can tell you a lot of Asian countries will not. America, on principle, will not. So how is this international Internet Ombudsman? It's a great idea, and I know and I agree that there is a need for us to move in that direction, but sometimes this could actually backfire.
Don't forget that the reason for the existence of the Internet Ombudsman, the national institution, is to allow us to hold accountable the private sector, right? This was the logic that led to this.
Yep.
We do not have a legal basis, a legal theory that allows government to delegate its own obligations of law enforcement to the private sector if we do not give the private sector a way out. Just like we have it in money laundering. If we want to hold them accountable, we need to give them a way out. And we do want to hold them accountable. So this is the way out for them, which they may then avail themselves of or not, because they are only recommendations. If they follow the recommendation, that's fine. If they don't, well, then you can also always, as an individual, take them to court. The thing is that each and every country will create that institution in accordance with its own traditions and laws. So if Singapore were to do it, and we very much hope that that would be the case, it would be whatever would be normal in Singapore in terms of having an individual, a group of people, a collegiate and so on, which may not be the same in Germany and in France and so on, but that's not important. There would be an agency that the private sector could address their concerns to, so that they don't get into the problem that they are in now, for instance, with the case in Poland, where they simply overreact because they're afraid that they will be criminalized by not taking down information that everybody should have access to, which is this terrible demonstration in Warsaw. So this is the logic. Now, if I get just a bit technical here, the reason why the private sector will be interested in putting the question to the ombudsman, who may be a collegiate or whatever in that particular country, is twofold. First of all, it will get them off the hook on the difficult judgment call.
Yep.
Second, and now it becomes just a bit technical, you have to distinguish between what you call absolute immunity and relative immunity. Now, absolute immunity to infrastructure providers, the Googles and the rest of them, is given under the Communications Decency Act in the US, 1996. You can, if you're interested, is Section 230C. In companies based in the US, and these companies have absolute immunity for content traveling on their infrastructure, if it's created by third parties, which it always is, more or less. In Europe, we have the e-commerce directive from year 2000, Article 15 and 14, which gives relative immunity. It is on the basis of this relative immunity that we have laws like the right to be forgotten and others that can hold the infrastructure providers accountable if it's manifestly illicit. The reason why the private sector will want to have an Internet Ombudsman is therefore twofold. First of all, because it will get them off the hook in difficult situations, which could have a reputation risk and also an advertising risk. And second, that if they follow the recommendation of the Internet Ombudsman, who may say, like he would say in the case of Warsaw, don't take it down, then they can put it back on again, and they will get immunity for whatever sanctions could be placed on them otherwise. So their interest in following the recommendation is twofold. If they follow the recommendation, they get absolute immunity, and they also get the assistance and the reputation that he can deliver. The real problem is, of course, the international Internet Ombudsman. Yeah. And I agree, this is a terribly complicated problem. Now, even though the initiative comes from Europe, and even though it is now before the Council of Europe, which again is 47 states, including Russia, for instance, unfortunately it doesn't include this country, and it doesn't include many other countries. We hope that the idea, which should certainly not be European, even though the idea comes from Europe, it should not be, and even though it may be based at The Hague for symbolic reasons, we hope that it will be universally accepted. And as I said before, a treaty which will allow all countries to sign up, and those that are not signed up would be on a grey list sort of. It'll be very complicated, I agree.
Right.
But it is not because the problem is complicated that we shouldn't solve it. We have no choice. We have to solve this problem.
Yes.
Otherwise, we will have what we call a balkanized internet or a splinternet. We will have an internet which is different in different countries, like an internet in China with a great firewall, which is their own internet with their sovereign laws, and the same here and the same all over the world. We will not have the universal, inclusive, empowerment internet that we all want.
Okay, on that note, I think we are ready for questions, comments from anyone in the audience. I know this is a fairly complex technical. Yes, you have a question. Yes, you. You have to go to the mic because we are recording this.
There's another one over there.
Well, it's very nice to hear both of you talk. So I have a
Your name,
question.
please. Sorry.
Yes, my name's Max Schreitan. So
Sorry.
Max Schreitan. So I have a simple question, maybe not simple. Want to ask the doctor. So, in your opinion, what is the international community regulation or international rules that you just mentioned about? In your opinion, in your perspective, thank you.
Sorry, did you get the question? I didn't
What
quite
is the
understand the
European?
question.
What is the international rules governing the internet from a European perspective? That was it, right?
Well, I remember during your talk you mentioned that like there is we have to we have to apply the international community rules. So because you mentioned that, I'm just very curious to know what are the rules about in your mind. Thank you.
Okay,
You got it?
Okay, now I got it. Yes, now I got
Okay.
it. If you look at the international treaties that will help us answer that question, there's first and foremost the ICCPR, which is the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights for the United Nations. And of course, there is the European Convention on Human Rights, there's the American Convention, and there is even an East African Convention and many other regional conventions that deal with the problem of free speech, because that is what we are dealing with here. And each and every one of them, there is no exception, has caveats. In other words, free speech is not absolute. As a wonderful book that I can recommend to everybody, written by Henry Kissinger a couple of years ago, where he says, is this technology, the internet, the only one ever that is above occasional abuse. Of course it's not. Of course it's not. The abuse of a right, the abuse of free speech, is not protected in any international treaty on human rights. It's very interesting that the US, in its First Amendment, has a different approach to free speech, because actually it says in the beginning that no law shall, right? No law shall restrict free speech, which is completely different from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the French Revolution, which is 2 years before that, 1789. And you may ask yourself, why this difference? Why is free speech in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1789 of the French Revolution restricted to within the limits of the law, which is what it says in Article 12.2, while the First Amendment says that no law shall, right? The European tradition says that you can restrict it, the American says that you cannot. How come this difference? I mean, both Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were in France during the French Revolution. What happened during those 2 years? Well, I have a theory, but it'll take us too long to look at that.
I guess
but the answer to your question is, apart from First Amendment, which is not an international instrument, which is a national law, the rest of the international community, which has signed up to these treaties, all accept that there are restrictions to free speech. And that is what we're talking about here.
So, so what you're saying is that all statements about free speech usually come with provisos, with reservations.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's never really free speech without any boundaries. That's actually a misnomer. Even in the USA, there are boundaries. You know.
Even in the US, it has been established with some leading cases. One of the cases, if you're interested, is Sullivan versus New York Times from 1964, which introduces the malignant intent. If certain statements are made with a malignant intent and with intent to hurt, that is not protected speech. If the speech will lead to immediate threat to public stability and so on and so forth, the imminent threat theory or the lit match theory, then it's not protected either. So even in the US.
Yes. Yes.
Good evening, Mr. Dan. My name is Leon. Sorry. I was wondering whether your organization deals with content on the dark web. Because the internet, as we all know, is the internet that we access through Google, mainstream browsers, only covers the surface, probably around 0.something%. Majority of the content, illegal content, is actually on the dark web. So on the dark web you can find things like child pornography, you can hire assassins to kill someone, you can watch a lot of graphic videos like people beheading other people. So I was wondering, how far is your reach? Can you do anything about content on the dark web? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I actually had occasion to work for a few conferences on the challenges posed by the darknet. Absolutely. The last one was at a UNESCO conference in Mauritius last month, where we discussed what do we do about the darknet. Because contrary to what happens on the surface net, which is only 10% of the internet as such, even the infrastructure providers don't know what's going on. And it's not traceable, and it has become a complete paradise for the stuff that you just mentioned. At that same conference, there was the leader of the Interpol section who gave a presentation on child pornography, how they had actually intercepted on the darknet 46,000 websites on which you could find parents sexually molesting their own children and selling those photos. So yes, indeed, we know about the problem. Now, the only practical way for me to deal with what's going on the darknet is, again, the business model. Because what's going on there is mainly financially, economically driven. And I can announce some very interesting news. Mm-hmm. Actually, yesterday, a bill was presented before the French Senate by Nathalie Goulet. I had the great honor of drafting that bill. which hopefully will be part of President Macron's new comprehensive legislation on fighting terrorism, because as I mentioned before, the emergency decree has been replaced by a law which then become later part of a bigger law. And the suggestion in this draft is that it will be illegal to buy bitcoins for cash, because that is how we stop that. Just imagine, bitcoins are actually legal currency all over the world except 3 or 4 countries, like Bangladesh and Ecuador, my last count, 3 or 4 countries. I don't know what happened that allowed that to happen, but from a legal point of view, it is because there is a distinction between an asset, or a unit of value, and a currency. It's clear to me now that bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies have become currencies. They are no longer assets or units of values. They are currencies. So what the different regulatory agencies did or did not do has proven to be unacceptable. The last that I read was there's like $80 billion circulating now of Bitcoin, and probably it's more because I read this yesterday. So the beauty about Bitcoins is, of course, that it's based on blockchains, right? Which means that we can trace it back to where the original Bitcoin was mined. And we also need a Bitcoin account, which does not necessarily have our name, but which has some sort of cryptology that may be deciphered by law enforcement if absolutely necessary. That can be done. It's not like breaking a key and an end-to-end encryption code. So the weak point of Bitcoins is not that when you buy them from your bank account, you cannot be traced, because of course, if you were to buy Bitcoins from your bank account, I could see that it comes from your bank account. I could see it was you. And I could afterwards see that you were buying this stuff on the internet of child pornography. I could see it was you. And you know what? You wouldn't do it then. And nobody would sell it then. But the weak point is that you can actually buy those Bitcoins in an ATM. And once you buy it in an ATM, not only will that business continue to flourish, but it will also be the biggest money laundering machine in the world. The compliance systems that we have put in place for banking that I told you about before are a joke if we let this happen. There were 1,022 ATMs in the US that let you buy Bitcoins for cash. There are 22 in Switzerland.
Okay.
And so the point
why
is,
don't we wrap
to
the
answer
point
your question,
Yeah.
the bill that I had the privilege of drafting yesterday was presented at the French Senate yesterday, and it would outlaw buying Bitcoins for cash. And we hope that will put an end to a lot of the criminal activities on the darknet.
I'm not sure whether it will, but it probably may help. Right. Thank you.
One step at a time.
Thank you. Right. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Lim Swee Kim from the NUS Society. I have a question. Does the AAID have any sort of recommendations or structure with regards to information, whether videos or graphics, with regards to the age groups? Because in Singapore, we are promoting our young to access the net even at a very young age in schools. Would the AAID offer any solutions or suggestions on how some of this can be segmented, or it's out of scope?
In terms of education and training?
The thing is that when we get on the net, we can access most everything, right?
What you're saying is, you know, there's an increasing problem of exposing very young people, children,
Oh, yes.
to the internet.
Okay.
Is that within the scope of AAID?
Absolutely. I should be glad, maybe someone, the organizers, can help to send to all those who are interested the link to our website. And you'll see on our website that actually we developed a year ago what we called an enhanced accountability standard for certain exposed groups. Children are definitely in that group. And women are also in that group. And it was very, very interesting that we developed that a year ago, which was before the Weinstein case, and all this fuss about harassment on the internet. I say fuss because unfortunately it has developed into a campaign of people denouncing everybody that they feel that they have to denounce, which creates another problem to the rule of law. But indeed, there are exposed groups in society. Women are very exposed. According to statistics I read, much more hate speech and discrimination is directed against women than against men, and the impact on women is much harder than on men. And it tends to maintain discrimination and so on and so forth. So we need a special standard of diligence on the providers when it comes to these exposed groups, women and children.
And there's a question, a related question online, and the question says, how would you suggest government agencies teach media literacy? What's your recommendation?
It's very interesting because in the bill that we proposed at the French Senate back in November for the internet on a question was fake news. Sorry,
Yeah.
we have in the preamble, as we call it in French, cause nationale, which means a national cause to have education at schools from the very early age of media literacy. And we were highly inspired by what goes on in Sweden. And I think we should all look at that experience from Sweden, which really shows the way of how media literacy is integrated from very, very early, almost kindergarten age, into the school curriculum. It will not only help develop this critical attitude to fake news and other toxic content that we're dealing with, but it will hopefully strengthen the democratic involvement of the new generation, which is really the generation at risk today. If you look at the news feed that our children get on Facebook, it is simply directed towards maintaining what they will be, what they are identified as consumers, creating bubbles or echo chambers, making sure that they will be whatever this news feed says that they will be. So yes, indeed, we need media literacy. We need not only accountability, but we also need to include it from the very early ages.
Yeah. So I guess the idea here is that we can't just be relying on legislation and regulation. We may also need to reach out to the people who interface, parents and teachers and so on, so that collectively it's all hands on deck approach in solving the problem.
Yes.
I think that's the general point that this question is putting up. Yes.
Hi, Mr. Dan Shefet. My name is Song Lin. I'm a graduate from the Environmental Studies program here at US. Just now, when you talk about how this kind of rules can be enforced, you mentioned that we are living in a reputation economy. So you are expecting the companies to bow to the reputational pressure. But in my opinion, internet operates on a popularity basis, which is, I would say, different from reputation. So let's say, for example, if I'm an online platform, I host fake news, I host hate speech, but I'm super popular, what incentive do I have? If I'm super popular, I would imagine there will be tons of advertisers who would love to put their advertisement on my website. So what incentive do I have to listen to the government's recommendations to take down those kind of messages? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it is your website. I will know it's you, and I'll go get you. And that is the point. Law enforcement, don't forget, law enforcement and public sector will, of course, exist. It is only when we don't know who the author is that we need to reach out to the private sector to do our job.
Yeah.
So any author who will continue on his blog in the fashion that you just described, and we can also follow the flow of funds if we want to know who's funding you and advertising, we'll find you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we've talked about reaching out to the private sector as only including the infrastructure providers. But I totally agree, and it's also part of AAID's analysis, that there is another part of the private sector that we should also reach out to, and that is the advertisers. The advertisers that would advertise on your blog, after having been put on notice what they're actually doing, that should be transparent, so that their reputation would be at stake. I mean, they advertise products in order to sell them. If the consumers know that they advertise products on a blog which contains hate speech, you know what? The consumers are not going to like that, and they're not going to buy the product. So we also need to reach out to that part of the private sector, and we have a policy of that in AID.
But what if his speech becomes popular among the society?
Well, I don't really see, you know.
Do you see that
I don't
happening?
really see a
Do you see that happening in Singapore?
Not yet, fortunately.
Is that an aspiration?
I don't really see Nike or Colgate or L'Oreal or anybody continuing to put ads on your hate speech website. I honestly don't see that once it's out. There may be a few who will think that it's a lovely idea, but that really doesn't defeat the whole purpose of holding accountable the advertisers. On the 14th and the 15th of March of this year, there were 2 days at Whitehall in London, which they call Facebook bashing. And they actually showed the advertising industry that sometimes inadvertently, the Procter & Gambles and the Marks & Spencers and the rest of them, through some algorithm, which is the best kept secret in the world, had placed ads on sites which were radicalizing. And you know what they did? They immediately stopped putting ads. And that created a big problem for Google and Facebook and the rest of them. So it is going to work the right way. And there'll always be 2 or 3 that think it's wonderful to put ads on a Nazi site or whatever, but we don't care about that. It's not going to change too much.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hi, good evening, Dan. My name is Ku Yong Sheng. I have 1 comment and 1 question. So for the first comment, the infrastructure providers such as Facebook and YouTube, they already have mechanisms for users to flag offensive content, right? So maybe what we need is that for those infrastructure providers to be more transparent in how they treat those users' response to videos or certain contents. That's my first comment. So for the question is, you mentioned that one of the roles of Ombudsman is to provide recommendations to the infrastructure provider on whether certain content is offensive. And how can we be sure that the Ombudsman actually represents the moral value of the rest of the populations?
Yeah.
So that question was also on Pigeonhole. Was it your question?
Yes.
Okay, right. So
I think that the first question was, how do we know how Facebook and the others are dealing with a takedown request in practical terms? I've had occasion to work on that question at a few sessions, involving sessions actually where representatives from both Google and Facebook were present. And they are open to be completely transparent. In other words, they're open to the idea that would allow each and every one to access a takedown request coming from you and to argue for and against why it should be taken down. They're actually open for that. The secret jurisprudence, as we call it, of some big company deciding and creating precedent and case law which we don't know about, they're actually open to open up for that. And that may be a way forward addressing the concern that you have, which is what happens to my complaint and why does it sometimes go this way and that way. The question of the Internet Ombudsman, again, as I mentioned, it'll be up to each and every country to appoint, to designate that office, that individual, or that collegiate, or whatever it is, in accordance with its own culture. And
but I mean, even if you have representative in different countries, each country can have a diverse group of people with different opinions.
Yeah, I mean, in Singapore, the Internet Ombudsman of Singapore would be appointed among the vast choice you have of highly reputed, renowned individuals with moral clout and so on and so forth that generally the public would trust.
But his point really is something that I think will resonate with quite a few of us, because even on some basic issues, we can't really agree, because there are people from very different religious and ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. Even socioeconomic class differences do shift perspectives, you know. So I guess the question is, how do you find that one person whose decisions would would clearly represent the views of the vast majority. And if it fails, then the credibility of that office goes down.
The Internet Ombudsman today is more an institution than it is a person. As I mentioned before, it's a Scandinavian term. Today is used for all intents and purposes in different countries to be the person or the institution that you can complain to consumer-related matters, and if you have a dispute with government and so on and so forth. Many countries have adopted the word, and again, it's up to them whether it is a person or an institution. Now, if you take the example from the data protection agencies, let's take that because it's very similar to what we're talking about. In Europe, we have data protection agencies. You also have one in this country. If you look at the debate that takes place at the data protection agencies in, for instance, France and in Germany and so on specific questions that they have to deal with, for instance, the Internet of Things. I had occasion yesterday to address the concerns of the smart cities in this country and mentioned a few cases that were put to the data protection agency on whether or not you should allow young people who just got a driver's license to have a cheaper insurance during the first 5 years if they would accept having constant GPS location and other information sent by them to the insurance company in question. Is that something that we could accept in different countries in Europe? And that question was put to the Data Protection Agency. There was a big debate. That debate is public. In the Data Protection Agency boards in countries, there are 5, 10, 20, whatever members, and they all had their say. And finally, there is a decision which is public. And in the particular case that I'm citing, the decision was no, we will not allow this insurance company to market this product because it's invasive, and we will not allow that. You may agree or not, but that was the decision. But it wasn't one person making a decision. It was the Data Protection Agency who has a precedent. You always have a precedent. So the collegiality of a decision is...
So really the answer is that it need not be one person. It could be an office or an institution comprising a group of people, and the modality in arriving at the decision could vary, right? It need not be a silver bullet solution. There could be dialogue sessions before you arrive at a decision. There could be different ways of doing it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Good evening, Mr. Shefet. I'm Rose from NUS, and I'm very interested in the concept of human flash search engine, or a similar concept of doxing, which is a practice often associated with the social activist group Anonymous, usually stigmatized as being for the purpose of identifying and exposing individuals to public humiliation. For instance, netizens will expose practices of abuse of power or some immoral practices of common citizens. Then in that case, do you think it is immoral or illegal, or it is widely accepted from a legal perspective?
You're talking about shaming?
Yes.
Shaming.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Shaming with the publicity of the individuals involved. For instance, their private information will be exposed online, like their names, their residential address, or their working place. Do you think it's legally?
You're asking him whether he thinks it's appropriate.
Yes.
I understand
Okay.
that that question was actually put to the Irish Supreme Court last year in a case involving Facebook. The individual in question, his initials are CG because he's not supposed to be known. He served a prison sentence of some 10 years, or whatever it was, for child molesting. And he was out of prison, starting his new life. He moved into this house, and somebody put his name and address on Facebook. And you can imagine what happened to him and his family. I mean, his car was smashed, stones through the window. He served his sentence, yet his life was destroyed. His children, his parents, he ended up, I don't know whether he ended up in a divorce or not. I think he did. But the point is that he served his sentence, yet he didn't have a new lease of life. And Facebook did not take down the reference, his address, and so on and so forth. He sued Facebook, and he won the case. He won the case. He was awarded symbolic damages. I think it was 20,000 quid or whatever. It's not important, it was symbolic. But it's a landslide case of the obligations to take down personally identifying information in cases like that. So yes, indeed, in this particular case, Facebook was held accountable.
So your point, your answer is you won't endorse that sort of practice, right?
Yes, I think that me
Shaming
personally,
and
if I was the Internet Ombudsman getting that question, my initial reaction, and probably would also be my final reaction, would say that the harm done to that individual and to free speech for that individual who has the right to stand up for his convictions without being threatened by the public pillory of reputation, that right is sacred.
Well, in that case, the person has already served his sentence, right?
Yeah, but even if not, I mean, if your life is at risk because your address and your details are on the internet, because you have a certain conviction, that should be taken out.
It amounts to harassment, isn't it?
Okay, thank you
And
very much.
who decides on whether the harassment is justified? It's subjective. And once you allow it, once you open the door, there's no controlling it.
It's really protecting free speech.
It's a slippery slope.
Yes, very slippery
Thank you.
and very
It
sloping.
is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll make this the last question.
Yeah, good evening, Dan. I am Abhishek. I'm a public policy student at NUS. I want to ask, because digital content is like a hydra-headed monster. It's like when you cut one head, the another one sprouts up somewhere else. So do you think putting up a mechanism like Internet Ombudsman where a certain content is being advised to be put down, and is there any guarantee the same content, even if slightly modified, will not sprout up in some other platform?
Yeah, that is the question of take down and stay down. That's the way it's called. Now, it's very interesting because I mentioned in the initial part of the presentation that we want to hold the private sector accountable because we believe that they have certain technological capability which actually they don't have. But when it comes to take down, stay down, they do have that technological capability. In other words, it doesn't pop up again. And we know that they have it in intellectual property. If you look at the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, Article 512 in the US, you will see that there's an obligation on the internet service providers, YouTube for instance. If the video, the song in question, infringes copyrights, and they're put on notice, hey, you stole my song, they must take it down. If somebody else puts it up, even if he tweets it a bit, they have an algorithm that can identify that. So it's not only taken down, it stays down. So that technology they have. They do not have the technology in the first instance to identify fake news, hate speech, and the rest of it because of the contextual, semantic complexity of language. But once it has been signaled, then they have the technology to make it stay down.
Thank you.
Right. So, as the moderator, let me ask you the final question. You know, when arbitration as a dispute resolution mechanism was introduced after the Second World War, many countries in the world, many jurisdictions would not accept it, right? I mean, group of people who arbitrate a particular case, why should I endorse it? Why should the courts endorse it? So as a result, there was the New York Convention, right? The 1948, I think.
56.
56. And the New York Convention, because it was a convention with more than 150 signatories, it gave it weight. People came together, they had to agree on the terms, and they had to sign off on that. Only then was there sufficient pressure on the various individual jurisdictions to do their level best to endorse the arbitral awards, right? But even then, the jurisdictions had the right not to accept it. but there was pressure because they were signatories to the convention. Now, I would put it to you that if aid does not, if the efforts of aid does not lead to something like a convention with signatories, it may be very difficult for us to implement in the various jurisdictions because you're dealing with sovereign rights.
Yes.
And even as we are talking about globalization, you're seeing both the centrifugal and centripetal forces of nationalism coming up. People are a lot more inward-looking, paradoxically, as we are being globalized. They're being a lot more defensive. So unless we move towards, aid moves towards some form of a treaty, international treaty, with sufficient numbers as signatories, a lot of the points that we are talking about may not happen at a global level. What are your plans and thoughts on this?
Well, I think that you're perfectly right that the way you describe the history of the recognition of arbitral awards under the New York Treaty is a wonderful example of how it takes time and how a certain critical mass is necessary. Absolutely. You may view the question from a slightly different angle. If content that's hurtful originates, well, it always originates in a country. It originates in country A, and it has a hurtful impact on somebody or on the society or on regional stability in country B and C. You may raise the question under public international law today whether country A, which is the country of origin of the toxic content, already has a public international law liability or responsibility for the private actor who acts on its country and its territory. There are a few cases. There is the smelter case, Canada-US, which actually was a pollution case. When a country pollutes the air, and air doesn't stop at a border, it travels, and it causes harm in another country. Actually, based on the on the smelter cases between Canada and the US, that country of origin is liable for the private activities of the factory, which are not owned by that government, but they're private, insofar as it has effects on another country.
Yeah.
The leading case, because it's in terms of protecting the environment, I think it's the analogy is clear, because I would call the content that originates in country A for toxic content, which is just as dangerous to the environment as global warming and so on and so forth. It's a pollution. You may very easily find the analogy. The newest leading case was actually Iran-US, with the hostage crisis that took place. Well, you probably all remember that American staff was held hostage at the embassy in Tehran. And you may not know, but there was a case afterwards before the International Court of Justice where the US actually won against Iran because Iran had failed to take the necessary steps as a state to prevent the private militia from taking these American staff hostage. That was deemed to be a violation of the duties on the public international law for the state insofar as acts committed by private parties on their territory have effect in other countries. So you may say that already today, could you envisage that if toxic content harms somebody in another territory, harms the democracy in another territory, harms stability and so on in another territory, that country A has a country of origin responsibility? You don't need to sign treaties for that, because that is what we call customary international law.
Yeah.
And as I said, we already have case law that confirms that. We have it in maritime law also.
Sure.
We even have it in space law. So the treaty would be necessary only insofar as we would want to materialize these obligations in institutions. And that is why the Internet Ombudsman could actually allow legal certainty in a domain of international public law where an obligation already exists, but it's very hard to define it.
Okay. On that note, I think it's a very heavy topic, I know. But it's a very weighty topic. It's something that we cannot ignore anymore. And I'm just very happy that people like Dan have stepped forward to initiate some action. And I feel privileged that I'm having the opportunity to work with him and the other members of the board. It's not going to be easy at all. It's not a walk in the park, but it's got to be done. And I'm sure there'll be many hiccups along the way, many pushbacks, but it's got to be done. It's important work. So on that note, I'd like you all to join me in thanking Dan, who flew all the way from Paris to share this with us.
A pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shefet, for your insightful sharing. We would now like to invite Mr. Bernard So, Director of NUS Alumni Relations, to present a token of appreciation to Mr. Shefet.
Dan, thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us.
Wow. Join the club. Okay, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, all right. Forward here and jump down here, right? That's right. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if anybody has any ideas how to solve this small problem we've spoken about, come forward. Let us hear them. Send us an email, please.
Dan, if I may invite you to take a seat.
Oh, yeah.
I've got a little bit of more proceedings to do.
Do I take a seat?
Well, this, in a sense, is a departure from all the You Alives that we had. And to do this, I'm going to invite Vishwa. Vishwa, please take a seat here. He's in the spotlight now. He likes putting people in the spotlight. But fellow alumni, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, You Alive, I don't know how many of you know. When did it start? 2000, no. You Alive started in 2011, 7 years ago. And it has featured 59 inspiring and incredible speakers. Other than tonight's speaker, Mr. Dan Shefet, and we indeed thank you for that very thought-provoking, it's heavy-going but nonetheless thought-provoking subject. We were also privileged to have heard from global thought leaders such as former UN Under-Secretary General, Dr. Nolene Hazer, and former diplomat, author, and dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. The series also featured leading lights from government and industry, such as Dr. Ng En Hen, the current Defense Minister, Ms. Indrani Raja, who is the Senior Minister of State for Law and Finance, and Mr. Daniel Boy. Some of us would be familiar with him. We affectionately nickname him the Godfather of Singapore fashion. As well as young movers and shakers such as Tan Ming Liang from Razor, law graduate, but he has gone into an entirely different field. And most recently, Mr. Peter Ho of Hope Technique. For those of you who have been joining us on a regular basis at this You Alive series, you too have your favorite speakers and would recall sessions that stood out for you. Now, after 7 wonderful and thought-provoking years, the time has come for us to take a pause, to reflect, and to discern the way forward. And at this juncture, I would like to draw upon the wisdom from the history of Egypt during the time of Joseph and the book of Genesis. That particular part that I would like to draw wisdom from is, after 7 years of plenty came 7 years of famine. We have just enjoyed 7 years of plenty. Plenty of food for thought, plenty of food for our souls. I think it would be unwise for us to just keep going without taking time to pause, to reflect, and to replenish. If we don't, I fear we will just keep going into possibly 7 years of famine of the mind and the soul. Not something we want, and not something we can afford to do. Actually, there is another reason why we would like to take this pause, and it is perhaps the more important reason. I shared with you that this series had featured 59 incredible and inspiring speakers. Every speaker was different. They brought with them diversity of knowledge, of views, of thoughts. But there was one constant face. The interviewer, moderator, extraordinaire. I'm of course talking about Vishwa. I know I exaggerate a bit, but mostly true. He has been at every single one of these sessions, facilitating, moderating, and keeping the discussions going, even during those difficult times when there was nary a question. You know how tough that is? And he keeps the discussion going, honest. How? He talks to himself, of course. Sorry about that. Couldn't resist it. Now, if after 7 years, we don't pause to give this Superman a much-needed rest, what does it say of us as an office, as an institution, and as a university?
You could have paid me.
Oh. Oh, we couldn't afford it. We couldn't have told you so publicly. But now that you mention, you don't know how expensive it is, right? And actually, the related note to that is, all the more we are appreciative of what he has done for us over the past 7 years. So on a bittersweet note, and with a great hesitation and perhaps a heavy heart, I announce that this is the last You Alive session for this year and for this series. We are deeply grateful to Vishwa, for your leadership, for your professional guidance in steering, for your personal involvement, and for your dedication.
I didn't script it.
To this series and to your alma mater.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you.
So we'll keep him standing for a moment. But just to manage the unbelievable immediate growth of his head, I would like to now turn to you, the audience, and just say that, in truth, what is a talk? Any talk without an audience. So on behalf of Vishwa, my colleagues, I thank all of you, our wonderful audience, for being very much a part of this wonderful series over the last 7 years. Thank you for your support. We couldn't have done this without you. And having said that, we will be getting in touch with you to seek your feedback and your views on what the future equivalent of You Alive might be. So when we get in touch with you, please do share your thoughts and feedback. And so now it gives me great pleasure and honor on behalf of the university to present a token of our deepest appreciation to my dear friend Vishwa. I give lah, don't be so anxious.
Checking how much inside there.
So the first one is just a simple envelope. but it comes with a very, very heavy appreciation. It's a letter of appreciation from none other than the NUS President, President Tan Chaw Chuan.
Thank
So
you.
on his behalf,
Thank you.
I present this to you. And on behalf of all of us who have enjoyed this so much, from my colleagues and I, this is our modest token of appreciation for all that you have done for this series and for your alma mater.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
In typical fashion, I always call it to a close here, but it would be remiss of me not to invite Visual to say a few words. Few words, huh?
You know, as they say, actually I have a mic, no? Can you hear me? Yeah. As they say, if you give a mic to a mama, it never comes back. Mama is a term of endearment for Indians. I think it's a term of endearment. Several years ago, as a member of the Alumni Advisory Board, together with folks like Harry here, and thank you for coming, Harry, we were talking about how we can make the experience of a student in NUS worthy of that of a world-class institution. There's no point saying that we are one of the top universities in the world if the total experience a student has in the 3, 4, or 6, 7 years is all about the curriculum. There has to be something more. You need to leave the university feeling inspired. That's the reason why from graduation we call it commencement. Because it's not the end, it's the commencement of the rest of your life. And the rest of your life has to be meaningful. And for it to be meaningful, it's got to touch lives. Not just yours. It's got to make a difference to the people who made it possible for you to have the university education. The people who are in your environment. The people who are sharing this world with you. So the whole idea here of creating you alive is that this university is alive. This university is alive because there are people who are alumni of this university, who are out there doing things that are meaningful. And the whole idea is to inspire students as well as fellow alumnus about what the possibilities are out there for us. And I can only hope that those of us who have taken part in the various sessions have had our hearts touched by at least one of the speakers. Because God knows we live in a world that needs inspired work. Some say God's work, but for those of us who may not believe in God, it's the same as doing inspired work. We need good people. We need good people with moral courage. And we need good people with moral courage and the stamina to do what's needed. And that's the whole purpose. And to be very honest with you, the last 7 years have not been easy. I've had to shift my travel work. I have to shift a lot of engagements to commit to this. But I do feel that it's worth it. Because after every session, I've had at least a couple of people come to tell me how much it meant to them. That's reward enough. So I'd like to say a very big thank you to all of you for inspiring me to stay the course for the past 7 years. I'm humbled. Thank you. Thank you.